Hey guys, Pete here. Westworld Season 1 Episode 3 aired last night and a lot of interesting stuff happened. This will be my recap and review for Episode 3 and will contain spoilers for everything that's happened in the show up to this point. I usually do a scene-by-scene breakdown in the first half with a summary and thoughts on the story at the end. This time the video is getting really long, so I'm breaking it up into two parts. This part you're watching now will be the scene-by-scene breakdown, and I will release the summary in a separate video tomorrow. I've already recorded the audio for both parts, so it'll definitely be coming out and you should check back for that. With all of that out of the way, let's get right. Episode 3, which is titled The Stray, starts off in the programming center. We see that Dolores is there with Bernard, and we notice that he asks her the same question about talking to anyone else about their interactions as he did the last time. This time Bernard brings Dolores a gift. It's a copy of Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, and he tells her that he used to read it to his son at night. He has her read a passage and asks her about it. She says it's about change and that it reminds her of the other books they've read. There's no indication of when they read other books, which made me question the timeline, but in a later scene when they meet again, everything appears to be in present time. There is an interesting exchange during their talk where Dolores asks him about where his son is. He tells her that he's somewhere she wouldn't understand, and then checks that her diagnostics to find out why she asked. She responds by saying that they had been talking for quite a while and that she hadn't asked him any personal questions. Personal questions are an ingratiating scheme. This is interesting for two reasons. One is that Bernard wasn't sure if she was improvising or not, and the second is that it gives us insight into how the hosts operate. It sounded natural to us as viewers, but it was actually the product of her programming. I feel like Bernard was hoping that it was a real question based on, their interactions, but in the end it was not. At this point, Dolores still seems to be without empathy or sympathy, which wouldn't be part of her core functioning. Cut back to her in her loop waking up at home. We see her new father to remind us what happened to the last one, and then we see her find a gun which appears to be out of place in her routine. She finds it in her top drawer as she's putting something away, which is something she would do every day, but seems thrown off by it being there. Of course, we saw her find it in the backyard while she was asleep in the previous episode. After she puts it back, she immediately has a flashback to the barn and her run-in with the men in black. We know that this is an actual memory of something that we saw happen, which is different from the other hosts returning to their previous narratives. I think this will turn out to be important, but for now, when she looks in the drawer again, the gun has disappeared. It looks like she gets back on her loop at that point. We find the guest William back in Sweetwater strolling down the street. He passes Clementine and then sees a man bringing in an outlaw to collect a bounty. He's intrigued by the scene, and while he's looking at the wanted posters, the man escapes and shoots all the hosts that are standing around him. The outlaw takes Clementine hostage to use as a shield in order to get away. As he moves into the street, William pulls his gun, and we find out that the guest can actually get shot when Boris fires on him first. In the end, William gets a shot in to take him out, rescuing the girl in the process. He turns down her advances when she offers to take him inside and show her gratitude, and we find out when Logan comes over that guests can't be killed, but they can be shot. It looks like it's something similar to getting shot with a rubber bullet, but they don't elaborate on how it works. When Logan tries to take him to the brothel, William says that he has something else in mind. He looks at a wanted poster and says he wants to go on an adventure. Logan tries to talk him out of it, but he decides to go anyways. We go back to the programming center where Teresa is waiting for Bernard. He mentions not getting much sleep the night before, which she doesn't care about because she says Ford's taking over the narrative at the 11th hour has the board worried. She tells him that Ford has carved out a huge part of the park for his new storyline, and that has thrown a bunch of existing storylines into disarray. He asks if there's anything he can do, and she reminds him that he told her that the update problem was under control, so she's wondering why his staff are still pulling the host to analyze them. We find Elsie checking out the host's tenderloin, who we saw Walter pouring milk over just before he was decommissioned. When researching this character to figure out who he was, I learned that he's the same guy who played the Geico caveman, which is pretty awesome. Anyways, we learn that Elsie is onto something here. As she shows Bernard the footage of when Walter glitched out, she tells him that the host is talking to someone. We find out that this someone is named Arnold and that Walter killed 6 hosts, but he also let 3 go. When she went back and pulled the narrative logs, she found out that the 6 he killed had all killed him in past stories, and it was like he was holding a grudge. Before Bernard can say anything about that, she gets a notification about a stray host. He tells her to go find it, and that he'll dig a little deeper and get Tenderloin back up on the surface. On the way up in the elevator with Stubbs, we get a better idea of what his perspective on things is. He says that he sleeps with his gun because the only thing that keeps the host from revolting is a line of their code. At first this seems a little paranoid, but when you think about it, this is probably a good attitude to have. We find Teddy with a female guest confronting a formidable character to collect a bounty. Gunfight breaks out and the guest shoots the outlaw host after he draws his gun. They handcuff their prize to a post outside the Mariposa and head inside to have a drink. Maeve isn't happy about them leaving the body on the porch, so Teddy gives her some coin for the trouble. As she grabs it, she has a flashback to when she saw his dead body after waking up from her nightmare. She looks put off by it, and we don't really see what happens next because Teddy sees Dolores through the window, which brings his loop back up. We see that it starts out the same way it always does when she drops the can of condensed milk, and he's there to pick it up. When they get out to the pasture, the dialogue changes a little bit. This time she says that what if she doesn't want to stay there, and says that she wonders if there isn't somewhere else they could go. Since he's been all around their world, she asks if there isn't a place where they could go rather than where they're at. As he's telling her about a place down south where the mountains meet the sea, where he's heard that a person can start over, we find out about his drive. When she puts him on the spot about leaving right away, he says that he has some reckoning to do before he can deserve a woman like her. They get back to the Abernathy home and we see the normal narrative of the bandits attacking before we cut away. Back at the programming center, we get this really cool sequence of an eyeball being built. Then we see the Ford has Teddy there asking him questions. He tells Ford his aspirations are to build a life with Dolores, only she is better than what he deserves. Ford tells him frankly that his job isn't to protect Dolores, but to keep her there so that guests can find her if they want to kill the wayward gunslinger and have their way with his girl. He asks if Teddy has ever wanted to run away with her, to which he replies that he has some reckoning to do first. Ford mentions his mysterious backstory and says that they actually never gave him one. They only gave him a formless guilt that he can never atone for. He tells Teddy that's why he's there and uploads a new narrative with a character named Wyatt. Teddy describes him as a sergeant that went missing and came back with some strange ideas. He says he was true evil and that he thought he could hear the voice of God. Back on the surface, we see Tenderloin and a new guest approach and proposition Dolores with a roll in the hay. As she's trying to leave, Teddy shows up to challenge the new guest, who tells Tenderloin he was looking for something easy. They decided that she isn't worth the lead and they all take off. Dolores and Teddy then leave together, but instead of doing their normal trip to the pasture, we see him trying to teach her how to shoot. After he shows her what to do, we find out she isn't able to pull the trigger. Not that she is afraid or doesn't want to pull the trigger or something like that, but that she's physically unable to do it, which makes us realize that she isn't programmed to do that. At that point, the sheriff rides up with a posse that includes the new female guest named Marty that we saw Teddy with earlier. She says they have a new bounty and that it sounds like a big one. The sheriff tells him the man in question gunned down an entire village, men, women, and children. He says he thinks it is Wyatt, who's the man that Teddy's been looking for quite some time. Teddy promises Dolores that he'll come back and then rides off with the posse. We cut to arguably the first funny scene in the series, where we find a bunch of hosts arguing over who will cut the firewood so that they can cook their rabbit. It's funny because we find out from Elsie that they've been stuck in this loop for 2 days on account of the fact that the stray host is the only one out of the group who was authorized to use the axe. Stubbs points out that weapons privileges have to be doled out selectively. Inside the stray's tent, we find out that he's been programmed to carve wood sculpture. Elsie explains that backstories aren't just to amuse the guests, but that they actually anchor the host and that wood carving is his cornerstone. As they talk, Elsie notices that the stray has been carving a pattern into his pieces, and then they go off trying to track him down. We find Teddy, the sheriff, and Marty riding in search of Wyatt. Teddy explains more about Wyatt's story, where we learn that his followers wear masks made out of bones. We also learn that they are completely devoted to Wyatt and will do anything he tells them to do. He tells the sheriff that he doesn't know all this stuff from tracking Wyatt, but that he was his sergeant and his friend. He tells them that Wyatt's strange ideas were that the land didn't belong to the natives or the new settlers, that it belonged to something that hadn't come yet. It belonged to him. They come across 3 men tied to a tree who all look to be dead. As Marty is inspecting the bodies, we realize that one is still alive when it coughs on her. In the same moment, we hear a mysterious noise in the background and the hosts from the posse start getting shot. While they're pinned down, we get the idea that Wyatt has a pretty large group of followers, which makes some of the guests in the posse want to break off. Teddy, the sheriff, and Marty all decide to stay, and they head off into the trees. Stubbs and Elsie are still looking for the stray host, and he points out that the design on the carving looks like a constellation. This leads to a little more humor when she asks if he's Galileo, and he says maybe it's in his backstory. Bernard approaches Ford at the programming center, telling him he wants to talk. Before they go, Ford reprimands a tech who has covered up one of the hosts that he's working on. He tells the tech that the hosts don't feel cold, they don't feel ashamed, and that they don't feel anything that they don't tell them to. And then he takes a scalpel to cut the host's face to make the point. Bernard and Ford go into his office to talk in private, where Ford seems annoyed that they're still talking about the problems that came up after the update. Bernard explains that they figured out that the hosts weren't only accessing old storylines, but they were actually hearing voices. Arnold's voice. We find out that Ford didn't create the park alone, that he actually had a partner in the early days named Arnold, who was no longer with the company, who was happy to scrub his name from the history of Westworld. We get a great flashback to when they were developing the park, which includes a shot of a young Dr. Ford. He explains in the beginning that they worked on the host without any guests to worry about. He says that the host learned to beat the Turing test in the first year, but that wasn't good enough for Arnold. He wanted to create consciousness. Ford goes into a somewhat technical explanation of what Arnold was trying to do, based on a psychological theory called the bicameral mind, which boils down to the human mind having 2 parts, one that appears to be thinking and a second that listens and obeys. Bernard points out that the hypothesis of early humans developing thinking that their thoughts were the voice of gods had been disproven, and Ford specifies that Arnold was not using it as an explanation of consciousness developing, but as a way to build consciousness or bootstrap consciousness. Ford points out that Arnold failed to take 2 important points into consideration. First, in an environment like this, the last thing you want them to be is conscious, and 2, the other hosts that believed their thoughts were actually the voices of gods. This led to lunacy, and they abandoned the plan with only the commands they used to control them left behind. They go back and forth a bit, and then Bernard asks what happened to Arnold. Ford says that he died in the park and that his personal life was somewhat tragic. He explained that he basically got lost in his work and his search for consciousness, and in the end didn't talk to anyone but the hosts. In his isolation, he started to see something in them that wasn't there. Ford then sends Bernard away with a warning not to make the same mistake as Arnold. Don't see something in the host that isn't there. They aren't real and they aren't capable of consciousness. When Bernard asks why he would, Ford talks to him much in the same way they talk to the hosts. He tells him that he knows that the death of his son still bothers him, almost making it sound like it's his drive or his cornerstone. We next see Bernard in a communications center talking to who we think is his wife or maybe an ex-wife. The scene could disprove a popular fan theory that Bernard is actually a host himself, or it could just be part of the entire setup. I haven't really bought into the theory wholeheartedly, but the last bit with Ford makes it seem more plausible. Either way, he talks to his wife about their son, and he says that this pain is all that he has left of him. Other than that, we come away with the idea that the park is really inaccessible, that while they're working there, the employees don't have much contact with the outside world. I read an interview with the showrunners, and they were talking about that, which it made sense because they were saying that with the kind of intellectual property they have there, they wouldn't want people to be able to come in and take it away. Catch back up with Stubbs and Elsie, who, while slipping away for a second, finds the stray. She finds him stuck in a crevice where he's unable to escape. We cut away to the trio who are tracking down Wyatt. They have a run-in with his followers, and there are a couple key things that stand out in this scene beyond just Teddy and the sheriff being massacred. The first is their look. They do have masks that look like they're made out of cattle skulls, and maybe some of them are made out of other kinds of skulls. The second thing is that they aren't carrying guns, but instead all seem to be wielding axes and knives. This part's interesting since we know that the stray who was likely headed in their direction was programmed in such a way to use weapons like that. The third notable thing is the most confusing. We see Teddy give Marty something, and then he tells tells her to leave. As she goes, he makes a last stand where he shoots a bunch of them at close range, but it doesn't seem to do any harm to them at all. Like, it doesn't seem to slow them down at even a little bit as they close in to hack him to bits. I've watched this several times and I didn't notice either Teddy or Marty killing or wounding any of them with their rifles either. I also can't tell what he gave her before she left. If any of you guys know what it is, like what he passed her, definitely let me know in the comments. I mean, you can see it's gold. It looks like a tube, but I don't know what else it is beyond that. Back at the Stray, Elsie tries to call Bernard, who doesn't answer, while Stubbs suits up to enter the crevice. She tells Bernard on the phone in a message that the Stray got an idea in his head, one that hadn't been programmed. We go back and we find out that Bernard doesn't answer because he's with Dolores. His talk with Ford has apparently got to him, and he tells her he needs her help, that he was just fascinated and now he thinks he might have made a mistake. He tells her that this place that she lives in is a terrible place for her, and she instinctively goes into her speech about some people choosing to see the ugliness before he cuts her off. He tells her to lose all scripted responses and to go into improvisation mode only. He asks her to imagine that there are two versions of herself, one that feels these things and asks these questions, and one that is safe. Which would she rather be? She says she doesn't understand that there aren't two versions of her, there's only one. She thinks that when she discovers who she is, that she'll be free, and this is the part that seals the deal for Bernard. He asks Analysis what prompted that response, and it replies, I don't know. Dolores asks if she's done something wrong or made a mistake. He responds by telling her the same thing Ford told him before, that evolution has formed the entirety of sentient life on this planet using only one tool, the mistake. He says it appears she's in good company, and then asks her if he ever told her the story about when he was teaching his son how to swim, about how Charlie was afraid to let go and how he also was afraid to let go. He said he had to. That's what parents do. And then he tells Dolores that he isn't going to change her back when she asks. He said, let's go down this path and see where it takes us. When she gets back to town, she sees the sheriff's deputy who brought the scared guest back to town ride up. She overhears him telling another man that Wyatt's men laid a trap for them. She asks if he's going to go back up there, which he says he will once the Rangers get there, but he leaves her with an ominous saying of, if there is a merciful God, those men are hopefully already dead. We see her pick up with her narrative arriving home just in time to hear the gunshots on top of the hill. When she arrives at her father's side, Tenderloin grabs her. While he has a hold of her, she sees a memory of her old father lying on the ground in the place of the new one. He drags her into the barn and throws her onto the pile of hay. We see that this time she grabbed the gun out of his holster along the way though. He gives the speech of a man who's met his match, but she still isn't able to pull the trigger when she first tries. As he starts to advance on her, she starts to see the man in black. She then hears a voice in her head say, kill him, and is able to override her programming to pull the trigger and shoot him in the neck. I notice it doesn't sound like Bernard's voice, which we've seen her here in the past. It almost sounds like Ford, but I guess it could be Arnold's or even someone else who's insignificant here. Can't really tell. And when she shot the figure of the man in black, we actually see Tenderloin die, not the man in black. She takes off from the barn while he's dying, and there's another sequence I don't quite understand. As she's moving away, a guest says, hey, come back here. The first time we see this happen, he shoots her in the stomach and we see her start to bleed. Right as she's looking at the wound, she hears him say the same thing over from the beginning, only this time she's able to get on her horse and ride away. Like I said, I don't really know what this is supposed to represent. Like, did she anticipate what was going to happen so that she could avoid it, or what? We go back to Stubbs, who now has lowered himself down to where the Stray is, and Elsie has put him in sleep mode. He opens up a kit to take out a saw, saying that they only need to get his head back to the center. He tells her to look away as he starts to work at cutting through the neck. Once he gets part of the way through, the host wakes up and starts to make his way up the rope towards Elsie after knocking Stubbs on the ground. She tries to stop it by turning it off, then decides to run away, only to fall on the ground as the Stray is coming out of the crevice. He picks up a rock which we think he's going to kill her with, but then starts to bash himself in the head until he falls over. This is a pretty key development, which I'll talk about in the summary later. William and Logan are at a campfire where Logan is complaining about spending $40,000 a day to sit in the woods woods alone playing white hat. They hear a noise, which we find out is Dolores stumbling through the woods. She collapses in his arms and the episode ends. That's it for the scene by scene, so I'm going to end this video here. Make sure you check back tomorrow to watch the second half with the summary of the major points of the story and a look at some of the different questions that it brought up. I also talk about a few of the most popular fan theories that are out there right now and what this episode means for them. Please like the video if you enjoyed it and subscribe so you won't miss the second part. Thanks for watching. I'll talk to you soon.